They told you that being afraid was a weakness. They didn't say it outright. No one handed you a rule book titled How to Hide Your Fear. But the message was clear from the start. The moment you cried too loudly, you were shushed. The moment you hesitated, you were told to man up, to be brave, to stop being so sensitive. The moment you showed fear, the world looked at you as if something was wrong with you, so you adapted. Not because you stopped being afraid, but because you learned to mask it. You smiled when your stomach was tied in knots. You laughed when you were trembling. You nodded when you didn't understand. You forced yourself to walk into rooms, into conversations, into lives that made your skin crawl because looking afraid felt worse than actually being afraid. And over time, you got good at it. So good, in fact, that even you started believing the act. You told yourself, I'm fine, so many times that you couldn't even tell when you were lying anymore. But here's the thing, your body never forgot. Your breath still quickened when things felt wrong. Your chest still tightened in the presence of danger, even if it was just emotional. Your jaw still clenched when you were being disrespected. Your legs still froze when you didn't know what to do. The fear never left. It just lost its permission to speak. And when fear doesn't speak, it screams in silence. It shows up in your overthinking, in the way you rehearse every conversation before it happens, in the way you edit yourself constantly to fit into rooms that were never built to hold your truth. It shows up in your relationships where you give too much too fast, hoping to secure love before it walks away. It shows up in your career where you chase perfection so relentlessly that you never stop to ask if any of it even matters to you, because deep down you're still afraid. Afraid of being too much, afraid of being not enough, afraid of being seen and still rejected, afraid of being invisible and never found. You carry that fear like a second skin, woven so tightly into your being that you forget it's even there. But let me ask you something. Who taught you that fear was the enemy? Because it wasn't your body. Your body knows fear is a signal, a language, a compass pointing toward what matters. Your body doesn't lie. It tightens around truth. It softens when you're safe. It recoils when something isn't right. It whispers, "This matters," when you're about to speak your heart. But you were taught to ignore it, to silence it, to distrust your own internal warning system because it made others uncomfortable. And now, here you are, functioning, performing, surviving, but disconnected. Disconnected from your instincts, from your emotions, from the messages your body has been trying to send you for years. You don't even notice when you're afraid anymore because you've buried that awareness beneath layers of armor, humor, charm, success, productivity, control. You've learned to dress your fear in ambition and call it drive. You've learned to coat your anxiety in achievement and call it confidence. But deep down, your nervous system knows. Your sleep knows. Your breath knows. The tension in your shoulders knows. And no amount of pretending can change the truth your body is holding. You were never broken for being afraid. You were just taught to hide it. And the longer you hide it, the louder it becomes. Not in words, but in symptoms, in exhaustion, in burnout, in snapping at people you love, in not being able to sit still, in being terrified of stillness because you know what will rise to the surface if things ever get too quiet. You think you're running toward success, but part of you knows you're running away from pain, from vulnerability, from the possibility that if you stop performing strength, people might finally see how much you're actually holding. But what if that's the point? What if people need to see what you're carrying? What if the only way to stop being afraid is not to pretend you're fearless, but to finally say, yes, I'm scared, and I'm still here? Because real courage doesn't come from never being afraid. It comes from walking into the fire while still trembling. It comes from speaking even when your voice shakes. It comes from admitting you don't know, but you're still willing to try. It comes from letting yourself be seen, messy, real, undone, and realizing you're still worthy of love. And maybe that's where all of this begins, not with being fearless, but with being honest. Because when you finally admit that you're afraid, a deeper truth begins to rise. One that's lived inside you far longer than fear itself. You weren't just taught to hide your fear. You were taught to be perfect, not to grow, not to learn, not to explore, but to perform, to impress, to execute flawlessly. And if you couldn't do that, then you needed to try harder, smile wider, dress better, speak cleaner, do more, be more. And so slowly, perfection became your survival strategy. You weren't allowed to just be. You had to earn your place. You had to prove your worth over and over again in every room, in every role, in every season of your life. Mistakes weren't learning opportunities. They were stains. Failures weren't growth. They were shame. And imperfection wasn't human. It was unacceptable. You learned how to measure yourself by metrics you didn't choose: grades, approval, beauty, status. You internalized the lie that love is conditional and worth is transactional. They didn't have to say it outright. No one had to sit you down and explain how this game works. You just watched. You watched the way people clapped for achievement but grew silent in the presence of struggle. You watched how validation followed excellence and shame followed mess. You watched how applause was reserved for the polished, the poised, the put together. And so you became that. You became what they needed you to be, what they rewarded, what they admired. And piece by piece, you abandoned yourself, not because you hated yourself, but because you were trying to survive. You became high functioning in your pain, hyper capable in your fear, masterful at hiding the cost of it all, and no one saw the collapse happening underneath. They saw the grades, the goals, the glow. They didn't see the panic attacks behind the smile, the self-loathing inside the discipline, the fear wrapped around every yes you gave when you meant no. The guilt every time you rested, the shame every time you failed. Because perfection doesn't give you peace. It gives you pressure. It doesn't give you joy. It gives you judgment. And no matter how much you achieve, it's never enough. There's always another level, another milestone, another expectation, another invisible line you must cross just to feel like you deserve to breathe. But here's the part no one tells you. When you're always trying to be perfect, you never get to be free. You can't laugh too loud. You can't cry in public. You can't be confused or angry or awkward or wrong. You can't be real. Because real is messy. Real is uncertain. Real is too risky when your whole life has been about controlling perception. You become a brand instead of a being, a reputation instead of a person, and it's lonely. Achingly, invisibly lonely, because no one can love the mask. They can only admire it. And admiration doesn't heal you. It only deepens the lie. So you stay trapped, seen but not known, praised but not understood, followed but not held. And maybe, for a while, that feels like enough. Until it doesn't. Until the pressure becomes louder than the praise. Until the exhaustion catches up. Until the silence after the success is too loud to ignore. Until you realize that everything you built is beautiful, but you're not in it. You built a life that impresses others but doesn't hold you. You became someone they would stay for, but in the process, you left yourself. But what if you stopped? Not stopped growing, not stopped caring, but stopped pretending, stopped proving, stopped measuring your worth in metrics that don't see your heart. What if perfection isn't the goal at all? What if it was never yours to carry? And what if freedom begins the moment you decide that you don't need to be extraordinary to be enough? You spent your whole life chasing enoughness. Not because you're greedy, not because you're flawed, but because somewhere along the way you were convinced you were starting from behind. That there was something missing in you, that you were born one step short of being worthy. And no one ever told you where the finish line was. So you ran. You ran through school, trying to be the smartest. You ran through relationships, trying to be the easiest to love. You ran through your career, trying to be the most competent, the most productive, the most admired. You ran so far for so long that you forgot what it was like to move without proving something. And still, it never felt like enough. No matter how much you accomplished, there was always something just out of reach. One more compliment you needed, one more person to impress, one more milestone to hit before you could finally exhale and say, maybe now I deserve to rest. Maybe now I'm allowed to just be. But the moment never came. Because the finish line keeps moving, and that's the nature of conditional worth. It's a hunger that feeds itself. You reach one peak and another rises. You quiet one voice and another screams louder. You fix one flaw and suddenly 5 more appear. You spend your life renovating a house that never lets you feel at home. And the cruelest part? You don't even know who convinced you that you were lacking in the first place. Maybe it was a teacher who expected perfection but never praised effort. Maybe it was a parent who only said, "I'm proud of you" when you won, not when you tried. Maybe it was a friend who joked about your body, your skin, your laugh, your silence until you believed them. Maybe it was a society that sells billions of dollars of solutions to problems it first invented. Or maybe it was all of them, layered, subtle, repeated, until it became your truth. And now, even in rooms full of applause, you wonder if they're clapping for the version of you that's real or just the one that performed well enough to be loved. You over-explain. You over-deliver. You overthink every word, every tone, every look. You apologize for taking up space. You shrink your needs to fit inside someone else's comfort zone. You stay quiet, not because you have nothing to say, but because you've been trained to believe your voice has to earn the right to speak. But let me ask you, what if you weren't behind? What if you were never missing anything? What if the whole system was a lie? A game designed to make you feel small enough to buy your way into wholeness, to perform your way into belonging, to polish yourself until the shine blinded even you. But enoughness isn't earned. It's remembered. It's the quiet truth that lived in you before the world handed you its checklist. Before the grades, before the mirror, before the rules, before the noise. That knowing that your breath alone was evidence that you belonged. that your existence didn't require proof, that your presence didn't need polish, and if you could return to that just for a moment, what might you find? Not perfection, not confidence, but something softer, something truer. A whisper that says you were always enough. You just forgot. Because even if you've started to question the lie of not being enough, there's another belief that holds on tighter, quieter, more dangerous. It's the one that whispers, if I don't prove myself, they'll leave. And maybe that's the real fear. Not that you're not good enough, but that if you ever stop trying to be, no one would stay. That love, in your experience, has always been a trade. You perform, they stay. You accommodate, they approve. You anticipate their needs. They offer crumbs of affection. And slowly, you start to believe that love is something you earn, not something you are. That closeness is a prize for good behavior, not a space you're inherently worthy to occupy. That your worthiness is only as strong as your usefulness. So you begin to shapeshift. You sense what they want, and you become it. You soften your tone. You smile through pain. You ignore red flags. You say yes when your whole body says no. You hold your breath in relationships, hoping you won't say the wrong thing, need the wrong thing, be the wrong thing. You learn how to disappear in plain sight. Because you think if you take up too much space, if you reveal too much mess, if you stop being impressive, the love will go away. You think that the only version of you that deserves to be held is the one that holds everyone else together. And the worst part? Sometimes you're right. Because some people were never loving you. They were loving the function you served, the comfort you gave, the ease with which you absorbed their chaos. And the moment you asked to be seen instead of being useful, they vanished. Not because you failed, but because the illusion broke. And every time that happened, it confirmed the lie even more. See? This is what happens when you show up honestly. You get left. So you went back to work, back to perfection, back to silence, back to managing their feelings, their needs, their expectations, and you called it love. You told yourself it was noble. You convinced yourself that self-sacrifice was your superpower, but inside, you were starving. Not for attention, not even for romance, but for the kind of love that doesn't flinch when you stop performing, the kind that doesn't punish you for being tired, the kind that doesn't require you to be perfect just to feel safe. You were starving to be chosen, not for how well you fit, but for who you really are when you stop trying to fit at all. Because that's the wound, isn't it? It's not just that you've been hurt, it's that you've been invisible in relationships that claim to see you. It's that you've poured oceans into people who offered you teaspoons in return. It's that you've convinced yourself crumbs are enough if you just stay hungry enough. And now you're exhausted. But you don't know how to stop. You don't know how to stop over-giving. You don't know how to stop over-explaining. You don't know how to stop shrinking. Because if you stop, what will be left? Will anyone stay? Will you still be loved? But here's what you've never been told. The love that leaves when you stop performing was never love. It was transaction. And you were never meant to live your life in emotional debt. Real love doesn't demand a mask. Real love doesn't require you to bleed for its comfort. Real love doesn't vanish when your edges show. It leans in. It listens. It stays. And maybe you've never fully had that before. Maybe you've been so busy proving yourself lovable that you forgot what it means to simply be loved. But you're allowed to remember now. You're allowed to stop auditioning. You're allowed to ask yourself, what if I didn't have to earn it anymore? What if I already am? And that's when it gets even more complicated, because just when you thought you were finally done performing, you realize you've been doing it again. This time in softer language. This time in spiritual words. This time in the name of healing, but still performing. You started therapy. You journaled, you meditated, you practiced boundaries, you read all the books, you posted quotes about growth, you spoke eloquently about trauma, about childhood wounds, about the nervous system. You learned to name your pain, and you told yourself this was it. This was how you'd finally get free. And in many ways, it helped. It really did. But something inside still feels tight, doesn't it? Something still feels like it's being watched, like every breakthrough has to be explained. Like your healing journey has become another space where you need to prove that you're getting it right. Another arena where you have to demonstrate progress just to feel like you're allowed to rest. You stopped chasing perfection in your work, but now you're chasing it in your healing. You don't cry without wondering if you're regressing. You don't feel anxious without wondering if you're doing something wrong. You don't rest without feeling guilty that you're not doing the work. Even in your attempt to break free, you've carried the same weight with different labels. The self-criticism just learned how to wear yoga pants and carry crystals. You've turned your pain into productivity, your trauma into timelines, your recovery into performance, because deep down, the part of you that still believes you have to earn love also believes you have to earn healing. So you show your work, you document your growth, you measure your softness, you look for feedback. You want someone, anyone, to say, yes, you're doing it right. You're good now. You're worthy now. Because if you're honest, healing isn't just about becoming whole. It's about becoming safe enough to finally be chosen. And maybe, without meaning to, you've made healing a new strategy for acceptance. You've turned your inner work into an outer project, something visible, tangible, something that can be recognized, applauded, affirmed, because when love has always been conditional, even self-love starts to carry conditions. I'll love myself when I'm more healed, when I'm more regulated, when I've broken all my patterns, when I've become less reactive, when I stop being triggered. But what if healing was never supposed to be a straight line? What if it's not something you accomplish, but something you allow? What if it's not a performance, not a project, not another attempt to perfect what was never broken to begin with? What if your nervous system isn't something to fix, but something to befriend? What if your patterns aren't shameful, but deeply intelligent attempts to protect you? What if your tears aren't setbacks, but sacred signals that something finally feels safe enough to rise? You don't need to perform your healing to earn your humanity. You don't need to prove your progress to be worthy of peace. You're allowed to be a work in progress and still be lovable. You're allowed to be messy and still be valid. You're allowed to hurt and still be held. Healing was never about erasing your wounds. It was always about holding them gently enough that they no longer have to scream to be seen. And maybe the most radical thing you can do is stop performing altogether. Even here, even now, especially now. It starts small, barely noticeable. A shift in how tightly you hold the steering wheel, the way your breath shortens when plans change, the subtle panic when someone doesn't text back fast enough, the way your jaw tenses when the future feels uncertain. At first, it feels normal, responsible even. You tell yourself you're just being proactive, organized, cautious. But underneath it all, you're bracing for impact, for betrayal, for abandonment, for chaos. You're not planning, you're protecting. Not creating structure, but building shields. You're trying to outrun something invisible, the part of life you can't predict. So you try to manage every variable. You prepare for every outcome. You rehearse conversations that haven't happened yet. You scan for emotional shifts in others before they're even aware of them. You read tone, energy, silence. You overanalyze, overprepare, overrespond. And it looks like you have it all together. But deep down, you're exhausted. Because what you're actually doing is trying to control life so it doesn't control you. You've equated peace with predictability, safety with certainty, control with calm. But peace doesn't come from knowing what's next. It comes from knowing you'll be okay regardless of what comes. And that kind of knowing doesn't come from gripping, it comes from trusting. But trust is hard when life has taught you the opposite. When unpredictability was once dangerous, when change came with loss, when someone's silence meant abandonment, when vulnerability ended in rejection, when letting go meant being let down. So you learned how to survive by staying ahead of everything. You told yourself, if I can just anticipate it, I won't get hurt. And you became excellent at it, hyper-aware, highly functional, remarkably controlled. And yet, somewhere in the middle of all that control, you stopped feeling safe. Because control isn't safety, it's tension dressed up as strength. It keeps your nervous system in a low hum of alertness. It makes you mistake anxiety for awareness. It rewards you with the illusion of security while robbing you of presence, softness, and rest. You're not calm. You're just prepared to be hurt. You're not grounded. You're rehearsing resilience in advance. And no matter how much you control, it never feels like enough. There's always something left to fix, to manage, to organize, to perfect. And so even your moments of rest come with an asterisk. You can sit down, but only after everything is done. You can breathe, but only if everyone is okay. You can soften, but only for a second, just in case. But what if safety didn't come from control? What if you could be held by something softer than structure? What if you could exhale without earning it? What if peace wasn't the reward at the end of productivity, but the baseline you return to when you stop pretending you're in charge of everything? You don't have to live in constant tension just because life once broke your trust. You're allowed to relearn softness. You're allowed to meet uncertainty with curiosity, not dread. You're allowed to admit that your grip has become a prison, that your strength, though admirable, is keeping you from experiencing life with your whole self. And maybe, just maybe, you're ready for more than survival now. Not because it's safe, not because you're fully healed, but because there's a part of you that's tired of holding the whole world together alone. A part of you that wants to surrender, not to give up, but to be held. And that part of you deserves peace, even if you haven't checked every box. Even if the future is still blurry, even if you're still learning how to trust what you cannot control, especially then. You keep looking for the exit, even when nothing's on fire, even when things are calm, even when someone is loving you gently, slowly, sincerely. Part of you is already scanning the room, the moment, the connection, for the first sign it's going to end, for the flaw, for the danger, for the shift, for the pattern you missed last time. You think you're being wise. You call it discernment. You call it caution. You call it protecting your peace. But underneath all the language, what you're really saying is, I don't trust that I'll survive not knowing. You crave certainty, not because you're impatient, but because unpredictability once meant pain. You equate not knowing with being blindsided. You equate surrender with helplessness. You equate presence with being unprepared. And so you live in the future, rehearsing pain before it arrives. You plan conversations that haven't happened. You prepare for endings that haven't come. You wait for betrayal even while being embraced. You ask questions like, what if it doesn't work out? What if they leave? What if it all falls apart? But you never ask the one that matters. What if it doesn't? What if the love stays? What if the dream unfolds? What if this moment is as good as it seems, not because you're being naive, but because you've done the work to receive it? Your fear isn't irrational. It's ancient. It remembers what it's like to be abandoned in silence. It remembers what it's like to be caught off guard by loss. It remembers what it's like to believe in something fully, only to watch it shatter. So now you pre-shatter everything. You pre-grieve what's not yet lost. You sabotage what's good so you can say, see? I knew it. You interrupt joy with suspicion. You interrupt love with distance. You interrupt peace with planning. And the worst part is, you've gotten so good at it, you don't even realize you're doing it anymore. You live with one foot out the door of your own life, always halfway. Always bracing, always rehearsing pain to avoid being surprised by it, but in doing so, you miss what's here. You miss what's now. You miss what's real. And maybe you think that if you can just prepare enough, control enough, know enough, you'll finally be able to relax. But preparation doesn't remove pain, it just delays presence. You weren't meant to live a pre-scripted life. You weren't made to walk through joy like it's a minefield. You weren't built to treat softness like a threat. You were built to feel, to risk, to trust. Not because there's a guarantee, but because there's a grace. The grace to survive disappointment, the grace to adapt to change, the grace to begin again if needed. But you don't need to live inside the tragedy before it happens. You're allowed to stay in the moment, even if it's temporary, even if it ends, even if it changes. You're allowed to taste joy without biting down, to be loved without calculating the exit, to rest without waiting for the collapse. Maybe the most courageous thing you can do now is to let yourself not know. Not because you don't care, but because you finally believe that even in the unknown, you'll be okay. And maybe, just maybe, that's what trust actually is. There's a silence you can't outrun. Not the silence of an empty room, not the quiet after someone leaves, but the silence inside you when there's no more noise to cover the truth. When the world gets quiet enough, and you finally hear how loud your loneliness has always been. It's not that you don't have people, you do. Maybe too many. Maybe everyone wants something from you. Maybe you're always the one they call, the one who listens, the one who carries, the one who gives without asking anything in return. And on the outside, it looks like you're surrounded. But inside, You're aching, not for more company, but for your own. Somewhere along the way, you left yourself behind. You got busy becoming what others needed. You got good at managing their emotions. You got skilled at reading the room. You adjusted, adapted, translated your needs into silence. And you forgot how to be with yourself, not the curated version, not the resilient version, but the honest, unfiltered, awkward, aching, alive version. You forgot what it's like to sit in your own presence without a to-do list, to take yourself on a walk without earbuds, to make yourself a meal with care, not as a reward, but as a ritual. To be with your sadness without trying to fix it, to be with your joy without trying to capture it. You forgot how to come home to your body, your breath, your stillness, and so now, whenever the noise fades, when the relationship ends, when the plan changes, when the screen goes dark, you panic. You call it boredom, but it's deeper. It's disconnection from yourself, from the one person who was supposed to stay, you. But it's not too late to come back. You don't need a map. You don't need to journal your way through it. You don't need to solve your loneliness like a puzzle. You just need to sit, to listen, to soften, to become curious again about who you are when no one else is in the room. There is a self beneath the performance, a presence beneath the productivity, a pulse beneath the pressure, and it's waiting, not with shame, not with judgment, but with an open door. You may not feel ready. You may not know what to say, but your body remembers. Your breath remembers. The earth remembers that you were not made to abandon yourself for belonging, that solitude is not emptiness, it's intimacy. So turn toward it, light a candle, sit with the ache. Listen for the voice beneath the fear, the one that says, I miss you, I'm still here, and I want you back. That voice is not gone. It's just been buried under years of trying to be everything for everyone. But now, in this quiet, in this space, you can choose to answer it. Not with performance, but with presence. You've survived everything. The heartbreak, the chaos, the loss, the silence, the pressure. The nights you thought would end you, the mornings you didn't think you could rise. You made it through every fire, every rupture, every room that tried to make you smaller. You did everything you were supposed to do, healed, grew, forgave, let go. And yet, you're still waiting to exhale. There's still a tension in your chest, a weight in your stomach, a hesitation in your step, a pause in your joy. You're not in crisis, but you're not at peace. You're not drowning, but you're not floating either. You're holding it together, but barely. Because surviving doesn't mean you feel safe. And that's what no one talks about. They praise your strength, your resilience, your comeback. They say, you're so brave, you're so grounded now, you're so wise. And you smile, you nod, you say thank you. But inside, your nervous system is still scanning the horizon. Your body is still bracing for what's next. Your mind is still rehearsing worst-case scenarios like prayers. You don't feel broken anymore, but you don't feel free either. Because no one told you that even after the healing, even after the boundaries, even after the transformation, you might still carry the memory of danger in your bones. You might still flinch at kindness. You might still over-explain when you set a boundary. You might still say, I'm fine, when you're clearly not. You might still expect abandonment when someone shows up with consistency, because your system hasn't caught up with your story. Your body still thinks you're in the middle of the storm, even though the sky is cleared. And that's not a flaw. That's intelligence. That's what kept you alive. Hypervigilance was your armor. Emotional detachment was your shield. Self-sufficiency was your sword. But now they're heavy, and you're tired. Not just tired in your muscles, but in your spirit. Tired of being on alert, tired of doing everything alone, tired of being the strong one, tired of holding space without being held. You don't need another breakthrough. You need safety. Safety to exhale. Safety to be soft. Safety to fall apart a little without losing everything. Safety to not know the answer. Safety to cry in front of someone who won't try to fix you. Safety to stop performing wellness and actually rest. And that kind of safety doesn't come from checking all the boxes. It doesn't come from proving how healed you are. It doesn't come from being regulated 100% of the time. It comes from being witnessed, from being met in your realness without fear, from someone saying, you don't have to hold it all together here. From looking in the mirror and finally believing, maybe I'm allowed to feel safe now, even if I'm still figuring it out. Because safety isn't a destination. It's a return to your body, to your breath, to the truth that you never needed to become anything more to deserve peace. You just needed someone, maybe even just yourself, to say, you made it. You're here. You're safe now. You are not broken. You've believed it for so long in so many quiet ways. You never said the words out loud, but they lived beneath everything. Beneath the self-help books, beneath the overworking, beneath the fixing, beneath the obsession with healing. There's always been that low hum inside you. Something's wrong with me. You felt it in every relationship where you asked for less than you needed. In every job where you overperformed and still felt like a fraud. In every mirror that reflected back a body you learned to critique before you could care for it. In every silence where your mind filled in the blanks with self-blame. In every apology you offered just for existing a little too loudly. You didn't choose that belief. It was handed to you, passed down, reinforced, whispered by people who didn't know how to hold their own pain, so they handed it to you instead. And maybe now, as you sit here at the end of all this searching, all this striving, all this unraveling, you're ready to ask, what if nothing was ever wrong with me? What if I wasn't too much? What if I wasn't not enough? What if I was never behind, never defective, never broken? What if all those years I spent trying to get better were not about becoming lovable, but about remembering that I already was? You are not broken. You are burdened. There's a difference. You carry grief that was never named, expectations that were never fair, stories that were never yours, trauma that was never your fault, generational patterns that you were too young to understand but old enough to inherit. And still, you kept going. You built strength where there was silence. You created love where there was absence. You made meaning out of pain. You turned survival into art. And yet you still thought, I must be the problem. But you never were. You were the one who held the weight no one else would. The one who kept showing up. The one who dared to heal even when the world asked you to stay wounded. You've already won 1,000 silent battles no one will ever see. And now you're allowed to stop fighting yourself. You're allowed to rest without earning it, to exist without explaining it, to feel without justifying it, to take up space without shrinking, to choose softness without apologizing, to trust joy without rehearsing the loss. You are allowed to live like someone who is already whole because you are. You always were